The first time Llaya Carter saw Alexander Royce, he filled the hotel ballroom like a storm fills the sky. Sudden, commanding, impossible to ignore. He wasn't just wealthy, he was wealth as performance. The kind of man tabloids splashed across covers. Private jets, antique cars, yachts with names longer than most people's bank accounts. Yet, when their eyes met that evening, his gaze wasn't cold marble. It was molten fire, hungry, searching. Llaya shouldn't have been there at all. She was just covering an event for a small arts magazine, interviewing gallery owners, slipping through the glittering crowd like someone who'd sneaked into a masquerade. She wore a rented dress, her notebook tucked into her evening bag. All around her, champagne clinked, diamonds sparked, conversations purred about hedge funds and villas in Capri. She had no place among them, but she lingered because she loved studying contrasts. These titans swaddled in excess, their hearts often emptier than the glasses they raised. And then came Alexander Royce. "Miss?" His voice thundered softly behind her. She turned, startled, finding him taller than she'd expected, jaw sharp, eyes gray like storm clouds before rain. He extended a hand as if introductions to him were not optional. "I don't believe I've seen you at one of these before." "I haven't," she replied, her voice smaller than intended. "Ah," he smiled, teeth white against a 5 o'clock shadow. "So you're the most interesting person here." The line would have sounded cheap from anyone else. But Alexander, power coiled around each syllable, made it feel more like decree. That night he didn't ask so much as surround her. He spoke about art with surprising passion, about architects he personally commissioned, about history's empires as if he too built one stone by stone. By dinner's end, Llaya realized she hadn't touched her pen once. Instead, she had been consumed by his orbit. And then the impossible happened. The next morning, her editor sent her a link. "Mystery woman captivates Alexander Royce at gala." A blurry photograph showed Llaya, surprised, caught mid-laugh at something he'd whispered. The story was speculation, mere gossip. But overnight, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Within 48 hours, a car pulled up to her tiny apartment. A driver waited beside a polished black Rolls-Royce. "Mr. Royce would like you to join him for lunch," the man said. At the restaurant, a 30-story rooftop wrapped in glass, Alexander gestured expansively at the skyline. "All of this is yours to look at," he said over wine. "But I want to give you more. I want to buy you the world." It wasn't bravado. Days later came the first flowers, orchids from Thailand, then roses from Morocco. Then jewelry shipped with handwritten notes. Then, absurdly, a weekend trip to Santorini. Everywhere they went, Alexander Royce bought silence. Entire restaurants were cleared so they could dine alone. Hotel floors sealed. Yacht trips where the crew acted more like ghosts than staff. When Llaya protested it was too much, he grinned. "Excess is my native tongue. Don't make me speak in half measures." Soon her small magazine job felt laughably irrelevant. Alexander whisked her to Paris for a single dinner, gifted her a painting by an artist she'd only ever admired in textbooks. Gold, silk, velvet, they became the air she breathed. Friends warned her she was drowning in spectacle. "Be careful," one whispered. "When men like him say love, they mean possession." But it was hard not to be bewitched. Alexander looked at her like she was rare. Not rare like diamonds, but rare like something money couldn't usually buy. Yet, ironically, he spent ceaselessly to keep proving it. One evening, in the penthouse of his London hotel, he pressed a velvet box into her hands. Inside shimmered a necklace with fire-red rubies. "It matches the air you bring into a room," he said. She touched the stones, heavy against her palm. "Alex," she whispered, "you don't have to buy me." For the first time, his expression darkened. "Don't mistake this for transaction," he said quietly. "It is devotion. Every empire leaves monuments. You are mine." The words both thrilled and terrified her. Weeks stretched into months, the relationship devouring her old life. Friends saw less of her, work fell away. The world knew Llaya Carter now not as a writer but as Alexander Royce's companion, a glittering phantom beside him at openings and board meetings. Photographers shouted her name, stylists curated her wardrobe, magazines speculated on whether she was the one. But inside, cracks formed. Because in quiet moments, late nights after champagne faded, Alexander never stopped moving. He planned expansions, called lawyers, barked at aides. His love was lavish when public, distracted when private. Llaya began to wonder, did he love her, or the image of her as part of his empire? And then, one night that would change everything, she wandered into a small bar tucked in an alley while Alexander closed another deal across town. She wanted anonymity, a drink without stares, a corner where nobody whispered her name. There, on a dim stage, a man sang with nothing but his guitar. His name was Caleb Hart. His voice was raw, not polished for profit, but aching with truth. Lyrics about longing, about emptiness wrapped in beauty, about chasing meaning beyond glossy surfaces. For the first time in months, Llaya didn't feel purchased, posed, or performed. She felt seen. After the set, Caleb passed by quietly, his hands rough from strings. He smiled gently. "Didn't think someone like you would sit through my noise." "It wasn't noise," she whispered. "Then stay a little while," he said. And she did. Hours later, walking back into Alexander's glittering car, her fingers still hummed with memory, not jewels, not yachts, not champagne, but a song from a stage that cost $10 to enter. The first fracture became undeniable. Alexander Royce had bought her the world, castles, diamonds, continents. But Caleb Hart had given her one thing money could never command: simplicity, truth. And love began to tilt. The Royce jet sliced across clouds toward Dubai, champagne bubbles rising like little golden suns in Llaya's glass. On the leather seat beside her, Alexander tapped through financial reports, barking questions at his aides across the cabin with barely a glance upward. When he did look, it was at her dress, her jewels, the way she presented as emblem rather than person. "This week you'll wear the sapphire set," he hummed absently, shutting his tablet. "The gala lights will reflect beautifully, and they'll remember you as much as me." Llaya smiled, practiced. But something aching pressed her ribs. 4 months now, every gesture of his love had come wrapped in wrapping paper more expensive than most houses. A villa in Tuscany, a locked jewelry vault that required her fingerprint, now even whispers of a private island he wanted renamed after her. At first it dazzled. Now it smothered. She turned her face toward the oval window, remembering the little alley bar where Caleb's voice had pierced her in a way even this flying palace could not. She wondered if he was performing tonight, selling $10 tickets to 15 strangers, fingertips bloody from steel strings, laughing with friends about a life unashamedly unpolished. And here she was, draped in wealth and yet somehow starving. By the time their convoy glided to the Emirati palace Alexander had booked entirely for a week, Llaya felt more actor than lover. At the gala that night, he introduced her to ministers as "my inspiration," dazzling smile wrapping every phrase, applause snapping like static through chandeliers. Yet his hand held her wrist tighter than was necessary, the grip of possession disguised as affection. Later, alone on the marble balcony overlooking the Gulf, she whispered to herself, "Why doesn't this feel like enough?" An answer came unbidden, not in the winds across the dunes but in memory, Caleb's voice raw and imperfect, singing about longing over loss. It haunted her nightly now. When they returned to New York, Alexander doubled down. He orchestrated a soiree where an orchestra played solely for her under a vaulted rotunda. He filled their penthouse with fresh irises, flown overnight from Holland. He even presented her with the deed to an estate in Provence. "Proof," he said proudly, "that there is nothing I would not buy for you." Her throat tightened around gratitude that felt hollow. She touched his cheek, offered the kiss expected, but deep inside a question thundered louder, "And what about what can't be bought?" She found excuses. At least once a week, when Alexander was consumed in meetings, she ventured into the city alone, pulling dark caps over her hair, seeking corners of the world less glossy. Inevitably, she ended up near Caleb's small bar. The second time she slipped into its smoky glow, his face betrayed subtle surprise but not arrogance. After his set, he sat across from her with only an iced tea, laughing about breaks in the sound system and how audiences sometimes forgot to clap. You could be anywhere else," he teased gently, eyes soft. She shrugged. "I think I was everywhere else already." None of it felt real. Something quiet lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. He didn't ask about Alexander, didn't need to. Anyone with eyes could see she wore a borrowed crown already too heavy. Over weeks, her visits became rhythm. Some nights she sat quietly in the corner, enchanted by the raw truth of his music. Other nights they walked after closing, sipping coffee down cracked sidewalks, his warmth so ordinary it glowed like treasure. One evening, in a deserted park with skyscrapers blinking high above, she finally admitted, "I have everything. Dresses, diamonds, cars, villas. He buys me the world, every day." And yet, she trailed off, eyes glistening. Caleb looked at her with a gentleness Alexander had never mastered. And yet none of it fills me like this. Silence. Then his hand reached for hers, not to claim but to comfort. Llaya's heart thundered. She knew she was stepping into danger. She also knew she'd never felt so alive. Back at the penthouse that night, Alexander awaited her. He was holding papers, his face glowing with triumph. "I've finalized the island," he announced. "Royce K. It'll carry your initials on every dock. People will tell stories of it for even centuries after." She stared at him, unable to summon awe. All she could hear was Caleb's laughter in that tiny bar. All she could feel was his rough, calloused hand against hers in a lonely park. That night, Alexander fell asleep beside her with the steady rhythm of a man proud of his empire. Llaya lay awake, staring at the ceiling, suffocating under rubies as cold as stone. The triangle had now fully formed. Alexander Royce, the tycoon who declared his love through ownership of the world. Caleb Hart, the man who had only songs, worn-down guitars and truth, but gave her what she most craved. And Llaya Carter, torn between the dazzling cage of wealth and the one thing it could not buy. In the morning, photographers caught her exiting the penthouse alone, her face partly hidden under dark glasses. Rumors stirred online. Where was she going? Who with? Was Royce's queen restless in her crown? Llaya read the headlines in silence as the car ferried her downtown. And she wondered, not for the first time, what is the price of freedom when everything else has already been bought for you? Alexander Royce was a man obsessed with control. He controlled empires, governments whispered his name, entire industries shifted on his investment alone. But control in his personal life had started to slip like sand through his fingers, though he refused to name it yet. At first he chalked it up to coincidence. Llaya coming home later than usual, a faint scent of cigarette smoke clinging to her jacket when she didn't smoke. The evasive smiles when he asked where she'd been, her soft insistence, "Just at a cafe wandering, I needed air." But Alexander didn't like ambiguity. Ambiguity meant variables. And variables were threats. At a dinner party one evening, friends congratulated him on commissioning Royce K., his private island, while Llaya sat beside him, her smile beautiful yet oddly distant. He noticed her gaze slipping toward the string quartet, her eyes glimmering not at jewels but at the haunting melody echoing through the room. A lingering softness crossed her face, a softness she didn't give him anymore. "What are you thinking?" he asked later when they were alone in the limousine. She shook her head gently. "It was the music. Beautiful, wasn't it?" "Yes," he said curtly. Then after a pause, his voice turned icier. "Sometimes it feels as though you disappear even when you sit right next to me." The conversation ended there. Her silence screamed louder than any words. Meanwhile, Caleb Hart saw her more frequently. Their meetings were still quiet, tucked into shadows of bars and back streets. But each time the bond deepened. He didn't drape her in diamonds, he draped her in attention. He didn't summon orchestras. He hummed chords on his battered guitar, letting her rest her head against his shoulder when the noise of the world overwhelmed her. One chilly night in November, after his set ended to modest applause, she lingered long after patrons left. They sat on overturned crates in the back alley, the cold wind biting but their laughter warm. "You shouldn't keep coming here," Caleb said softly, though his hand brushed hers like a confession. "Probably not," she whispered. "But you do." She met his eyes, fire glinting in her own. "Because here," she gestured at the cracked bricks, the neon light flickering above. "Here I feel more real than in a palace." For a heartbeat the world seemed to still. Caleb leaned close, their lips brushing in an unspoken answer, and Llaya knew she had tumbled past the edge she swore she'd never cross. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was love, raw and frightening. The next morning, Alexander noticed something immediately. Her voice carried a fragile hum, her cheeks flushed, her smile distracted. To the rest of the world it was glow. To Alexander it was anomaly. "Where were you last night?" he asked casually over breakfast. Out walking, she said. His knife sliced too hard through toast. He didn't press, not yet. But he ordered an aide to tidy her schedule, leaving unspoken that he wanted someone watching when he wasn't near. For the first time in his empire's history, his obsession wasn't about numbers or headlines. It was about losing the one woman he had vowed to own. 2 weeks later, whispers reached him. One of his quiet watchers reported Llaya in a downtown district, her cap pulled low, slipping into an alley bar where a scruffy musician played songs until close. Alexander stared at the report with frothing disbelief. His temples pounded. A bar. A stranger. Some nobody with a guitar? What? That night, he booked out an entire 5-star restaurant for them, lining each table with roses, chandeliers dripping above. He presented her with a diamond bracelet so radiant the maitre d' stood stunned. I don't want you wandering, Alexander said as he clasped it on her wrist. His voice was smooth but control dripped from it like venom. You have everything here. Why look elsewhere? Her throat tightened. She pressed a smile, but the words clanged inside her head. Everything here except freedom. Later, as she stood alone in the powder room, she stared at the bracelet. It glittered, yes, but heavier than chains. When she next saw Caleb, she whispered through trembling lips, I'm living in a golden cage. His hand wrapped hers tightly, earnest. Then let me be the key. She cried softly into his shoulder, tasting both terror and relief. For she knew the cage door would one day burst open, but not gently. Back at the penthouse, Alexander's paranoia sharpened. He searched for signs in her phone, in her expressions, even in the way she sighed at night. And though he found nothing tangible, his instincts hissed truth. Betrayal circled him like vultures. One midnight, alone on his balcony, he whispered to himself, if she thinks she'll leave, she underestimates me. The empire quaked under the pressure of love it could not contain. Llaya, suffocating under diamonds, longing in alleys. Caleb, offering her every ounce of sincerity, even knowing the storm ahead. Alexander, billionaire king clutching tighter, determined that what he bought, what he crowned as his, would never slip away. The world saw only glamour in magazines, her smiling beside him on red carpets, diamonds dripping as headlines swooned. But beneath it, a triangle sharpened with every glance, every touch, every lie. And one thing was certain now, the next crack wouldn't stay hidden. It would roar, and when it did, not even Alexander Royce's billions could silence the collapse. The penthouse no longer felt like a home. It felt like a gilded command center. Llaya noticed at the moment she returned from a gallery outing, Alexander's aides bustling too often through corridors, their eyes lingering on her longer than before. Memos for security audits stacked on tables. Her phone, returned once from a forgotten cafe visit, seemed oddly heavier in her hand, as if unseen eyes had brushed the screen. Alexander had reinforced the cage. One night as they hosted a delegation of investors, his hand never left her arm. At first it was affectionate. By the 4th hour, it was possession, a reminder to her and every guest that she was his acquisition. Under the crystal chandeliers, she smiled perfectly, her lips aching from the strain. As the final guest departed, she whispered coldly, You don't have to pin me to your side like glassware. Alexander's smile faltered. His gray eyes darkened into storm clouds. The world wants what's mine. That includes you. Do you expect me to relax while jackals circle? What do you think I am? She snapped. A painting to guard at night? His reply was quiet, terrifying. No, Llaya. You are rarer than any painting. Which is why I won't let you slip into someone else's hands. That night, she lay awake beside him, diamonds heavy on her nightstand, her chest crushed by invisible walls. She realized then, Alexander didn't love her freedom. He loved her captivity. 2 days later, she fled to Caleb's bar again, slipping through the back to avoid eyes she swore were trailing her. The dim lights, scratched wooden tables, and familiar scent of cheap beer felt safer than any palace. Caleb closed early when he saw her trembling. They sat in silence until she finally whispered, He's watching me. Everywhere. He took her hand, rough thumb brushing over her knuckles. That's not love, Llaya. That's possession. Her tears fell hot and fast. He gives me everything. Private islands. Villas. Jewels. He tells the world I'm his queen. And yet, all I want is to sit here with you listening to songs in cracked alleys. Caleb kissed her hand softly. Because here you're Llaya. With him you're Royce's prize. She broke then, pulling him close, their lips meeting not in recklessness but in desperate affirmation. In that moment she knew money had already lost. Her heart had chosen. But Alexander Royce hadn't built an empire on ignorance. He saw too much. That weekend, at a charity event photographed by dozens of flashing bulbs, he leaned to whisper in her ear between camera shutters, "Who is he?" She stiffened, her blood turning to ice. "What are you talking about?" His gaze cut like a blade. "You smell of smoke and coffee when you come home. Not from boardrooms. Not from friends. Someone else is in that air. Someone who doesn't belong." She tried to hold his stare. Maybe it's the smell of freedom. For the first time Alexander faltered as though struck. Cameras clicked. He masked it with a stiff smile, but rage coiled behind his eyes. By Monday morning, stories began leaking to tabloids. Not names, not yet. But headlines asking, is Alexander Royce losing control of his queen? Photographers caught shots of her slipping into cars without him. Stories circulated about her late arrival's home. Inside his tower office, Alexander barked at aides, "Plug the leaks. Find the source. If she's betrayed me, I'll bury whoever touched her." Fear and fury tangled into obsession. Back at the hotel suite where she met Caleb, Llaya trembled reading the speculation on her phone. "He knows Caleb. He almost said it. If he finds us." Caleb wrapped her shoulders tightly. "Then let him. I won't hide you like some shame. You're human, Llaya. And you deserve to be loved, not purchased." Her sobs broke as she buried her face into his chest, heart divided by terror and liberation. That night, Alexander confronted her again. Penthouse lit only by the flicker of city lights, he closed the door behind him and stared like an executioner. "Do you love me?" His voice was raw, unguarded for once. "Yes," she whispered, then hesitated. "But not the way you need me to." The silence that followed cracked like porcelain. Alexander's empire, the jets, the towers, the villas, could silence presidents and buy silence from foes. But he realized in that moment it could not buy the one answer he craved. And in his chest, a terrifying conviction grew. If money couldn't buy her heart, he'd use it to cage it harder until it bent. Meanwhile, journalists sharpened their knives as whispers multiplied. One gossip reporter claimed to have heard her laughter at a downtown bar late at night, her hand brushing someone else's. Investors speculated whether Royce's empire could withstand scandal. The triangle was no longer safe in shadows. Each player felt the storm coming. Alexander, sensing betrayal, prepared to crush it with resources unimaginable. Llaya, torn between cage and freedom, teetered on open defiance. Caleb, fragile yet fierce, braced for the wrath of a man who could topple fortunes overnight. When empires crumble, they rarely do so from rivals outside. They collapse from fractures within. And Alexander Royce, billionaire king who had bought the world, now felt those fractures splitting through his own home, his own bed, his own heart. Soon the world would hear the crack. By December, Alexander's patience had evaporated. A man who could bend markets with a glance was not accustomed to uncertainty in his own home. He unleashed the full force of his empire's reach, though cloaked in the language of protection. A new driver appeared in Llaya's life, quiet but watchful. Her schedule filled with charity luncheons she hadn't agreed to, her assistants refusing to acknowledge any oversight. Even her phone, warm against her palm, sometimes flickered strangely, as though another presence lurked in its circuitry. Alexander never admitted it outright. But in boardrooms he ordered analysts to investigate gossip sources. In private he demanded reports on her movements, right down to which coffee stool she had lingered at. The billionaire king wasn't merely loved, he was paranoid, and paranoia is hunger sharpened to a blade. At dinner one evening, Llaya confronted him. The penthouse was ablaze with candlelight across black marble, plates of caviar untouched between them. "Why am I followed everywhere?" she asked quietly. Alexander's jaw flexed. "Because the world is full of people who'd exploit you, Llaya. Because I can't risk losing the only truth I've found." Her eyes narrowed. "You mean you can't risk losing possession?" His gaze froze, soft not with guilt but with fury contained. "Don't twist devotion into control. You've lived in cages before, haven't you? Poverty. Fear. Do you want to go back to that? Lila's voice cracked but stayed firm. I'd rather go back to poverty than live in a palace where I can't breathe. The silence that followed was more violent than any argument. That night, Llaya left while he fell into restless sleep. Dressed in a simple coat, dark glasses, she slipped into a yellow cab instead of the Royce convoy waiting downstairs. She didn't care if his eyes spotted her absence later. She couldn't stand the suffocation another moment. She went to Caleb. He was packing up his guitar at the bar when she arrived, slipping inside like a ghost anxious for refuge. He froze when he saw her, hair windswept, eyes glistening, clutching her coat around her shoulders. I couldn't stay there anymore, she whispered desperately. He set the guitar down and held her as if trying to still her trembling. They walked into the night air, calm neon buzzing overhead. It's madness, Llaya. He'll find you anywhere. He's not like the rest of us. He has eyes everywhere. I don't care anymore, she said fiercely, clutching him. If I'm already trapped, I'd rather be trapped in truth than smothered by everything he buys. Her lips met his, a kiss not of curiosity this time but of surrender. For the first time since Alexander had swept her into impossible riches, she felt not owned but loved. The following morning, tabloids stirred. A paparazzo who had loitered near the bar caught blurs of Llaya leaving in Caleb's arms, her head against his chest. The photos weren't sharp enough for confirmation, but speculation ignited like wildfire. Who is the man beside Royce's queen? One headline teased. Royce love story cracking? Mystery late-night companion spotted. When Alexander saw the spreads over breakfast, his spoon clattered hard into bone china. His aides went silent, watching their chief's calm veneer fracture. Find him, Alexander whispered. His voice wasn't loud, but it was lethal. By noon, dossiers landed on his desk. Caleb Hart, 32. Musician. Penniless. Played small bars for tips. Arrest record clean. No scandals. Too clean. That too clean cut deeper than dirt. Because it meant Caleb wasn't blackmailing Llaya, wasn't exploiting by scandal. No worse, it meant she might actually love him. That night, Alexander summoned Llaya to the penthouse balcony, the city vibrating bright behind them. He held her hands firmly, his eyes molten gray steel. I don't care about foolish gossip, he said quietly. I'll fight it. I'll buy silence 10 times over. But you tell me here now under this sky, is there someone else in you? Llaya stared into those brutal eyes, the eyes that owned armies and oceans. For once she did not soften. Yes. The single syllable shattered him more than ruinous acquisitions ever had. His breath hissed like an animal struck. He dropped her hands, staggering back as though she'd stabbed him. After everything, he spat. Every gift, every monument. I bought you the world, Llaya. The world. Her eyes welled. And the world is heavy, Alexander. All I needed was a heartbeat. And you can't buy that. His fury erupted. He hurled the nearest glass against the balcony, shards scattering into the night air like dying stars. His chest heaved, rage and heartbreak colliding into something terrifying. But his voice when it came was low and chilling. If you walk away into war. And understand, war is the only language I've mastered. Llaya trembled but did not waver. So be it. She left the penthouse that night not in a Rolls Royce but in silence, clutching only her coat as she returned to Caleb's arms. Outside, the city already buzzed with speculation. Cameras waited. The triangle that had been whispers and shadows was now flickering under the world's light. Alexander Royce, billionaire betrayed, sharpening vengeance with every breath. Llaya Carter, no longer dazzled, choosing authenticity in spite of fear. Caleb Hart, quiet musician, the one thing Alexander could never buy, representing the love that threatened an empire. The question was no longer if the world would find out. The question was how violent the eruption would be when it did. The morning after Llaya's confession, the city awoke not to the sound of church bells or market bells but to the shrill of tabloids screaming across newsstands. Alexander Royce betrayed by mystery musician? Photos, grainy but undeniable, showed her walking beside Caleb Hart, his arm around her as they slipped into the shadows of a downtown alley. Though her face was partly obscured, the story wrote itself. The queen of an empire slipping into a different kingdom. Alexander's publicists worked feverishly. Reporters were bombarded with press releases calling the rumors malicious fabrications. Internet gossip pages received veiled legal threats. But the denials only fanned the flames. Investor calls roared with questions about what a scandal meant for Royce Global Holdings, and rivals smelled blood in the air. Inside the penthouse, Alexander stared for hours at the photographs, each pixel puncturing his pride. His aides hovered nervously. "Find him," Alexander ordered finally. "Find Hart. Tear him apart piece by piece. Anyone who associates with him, anyone in his orbit." Scorched earth. His men moved quickly. Within 2 days, stories trickled out. Caleb defaulted once on a loan, Caleb lived in a dingy apartment, Caleb's mother worked 2 jobs to support her family. None of it was truly shameful, but in Alexander's hands, flaws became headlines. Llaya Carter abandons billionaire to slum with struggling guitarist. For the first time in her life, Llaya was branded with cruelty not from poverty but from wealth. Paparazzi hounded her downtown shouting questions. "Is he good enough for you? What's he giving you that Royce's money couldn't?" Reporters swarmed Caleb's neighborhood, filming his cracked windows, mocking his old guitar case. Caleb bristled but kept calm. "I knew he'd come for me," he told Llaya one night, pouring cheap wine into mismatched glasses. "But what he doesn't know is, you can't humiliate a man who's already lived without." She smiled faintly, touching his cheek. "He can't buy truth. That's why he hates you." But Alexander was relentless. He launched a smear campaign across glossy magazines. Friends once charmed by Llaya whispered behind manicured hands that she'd lost her mind, throwing away empire for a fool with calluses. Invitations that once glistened on her phone vanished overnight. She was no longer the queen of society headlines but its scandal. One night, as they ducked into Caleb's apartment to escape cameras on the street below, Llaya whispered, "Maybe I should let him win. Maybe I should walk away, save you from this." Caleb shocked her by laughing, a deep, defiant laugh that echoed against the peeling wallpaper. "I've been invisible my whole life. Now the richest man on earth fears me. That means we've already won." Still, fear lurked in her veins. She knew Alexander wasn't finished. He wasn't the type of man to lick wounds. He was the type to weaponize them. And she was right. 2 weeks later he finally struck outright. At a shareholder gala, broadcast live across networks, Alexander delivered a speech cloaked with venom. Beside him stood no Llaya. She was absent, her chair deliberately empty. The billionaire's voice boomed across chandeliers. "I built empires. I raised nations from dust. And I gave one woman, the woman I loved, the world itself. Villas, islands, crowns. And yet she spat on devotion for cheap affection. For fraud disguised as simplicity. This betrayal isn't mine. It disgraces her." The audience gasped, cameras flashing wildly. In one calculated moment, Alexander had weaponized heartbreak into theater. Investors applauded his defiance, but viewers at home saw equal parts rage and desperation. When Llaya watched footage that night on Caleb's TV, she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "He'll never stop. He'll burn cities before he lets go." Caleb sat beside her, arm around her tense shoulders. "Then let him burn. We'll survive the ashes." But his optimism couldn't fully soften reality. Her credit cards mysteriously stopped working. Bank accounts once filled with allowances froze without warning. Their hotel stays were canceled mid-reservation. Alexander held strings Llaya hadn't known existed until he cut them. In those harsh days, Caleb became her anchor. They lived humbly, meals cooked with pasta and canned tomatoes, nights on a lumpy couch playing old records. She hated the paparazzi's mocking photos of her carrying laundry baskets down cracked stairs, headlines sneering from penthouse to laundromat queen. Yet somewhere between the mundane and the mocked, she felt something wondrous, normal. With Caleb, laughter came unforced. Time was measured in songs, not schedules. For the first time since the gala months ago, she felt like herself. Meanwhile, Alexander simmered in skyscraper solitude. His empire endured but bruised. Magazine covers wondered whether personal instability threatened Royce Holdings. For the first time, board members raised voices against him. And in whispers across penthouse halls, the question arose, can even Royce's billions rebuild dignity once love has turned to scandal? He poured scotch at 3 a.m., staring at city lights, muttering to the empty room, she'll come back. She has to. She can't forsake monuments for music. But deep down, even Alexander Royce knew, power could construct glass towers but not hearts. And hearts were where he'd lost. Within weeks, the triangle had become legend whispered across the world. Alexander Royce, billionaire bruised, his empire faltering under fury. Llaya Carter, once crown jewel, now exile, mocked and adored in equal measure for choosing love over dynasty. Caleb Hart, the musician whose songs cost $10 but rattled a king's throne. The war wasn't over. Alexander still had armies, lawyers, lobbyists, media. Yet even his billions couldn't erase the haunting truth echoing across every scandal column, every shareholder meeting. He bought her the world. And she had chosen something he could never touch. Winter had settled over Manhattan, but the cold came not just from the icy winds slicing down Fifth Avenue. It came from Alexander Royce's fury, now weaponized through the tools of his empire. When money fails to buy love, it is often redirected into war. The lawsuits came first. Filed with precise timing across multiple courts, they painted Llaya as an unfaithful cohabitant, who had leveraged Mr. Royce's generosity for secret affairs. Caleb Hart was accused of defamation of character, for allegedly interfering in contractual obligations. The claims were excessive, theatrical, but their purpose was clear: humiliate, exhaust, and drain. Tabloids exploded with headlines, Royce takes former lover to court, and who is Caleb Hart? From guitar strings to court strings. Llaya spent grueling hours in deposition rooms, her hands trembling as attorneys grilled her with invasive questions. When had she last made love to Royce? How much jewelry still sat in her safe? Did Hart know she was using a billionaire's resources while slipping into alleyway bars? Through it all, Llaya answered with dignity. Love is not transaction, she repeated steadily. I did not leave for wealth. I left for freedom. Caleb sat outside those rooms each day, waiting with quiet devotion. When she emerged pale-faced, he would simply wrap his jacket around her shoulders and say, "We'll make it through." But the strain dug trenches in his spirit too. For the first time, critics turned their gaze more fiercely upon him than her. Opinion writers mocked. A billionaire loses his queen to a man who can't even pay his rent. Paparazzi camped outside his mother's house, hounding her with cruel questions about her disgraced son. Caleb remained defiant in public, but alone with Llaya at night, she saw the doubt darken his eyes. They're right, he admitted one night in their tiny apartment. I can't protect you like he can. I can't shield you from this. One phone call from him ruins me forever. His fists clenched, voice quivering with impotence. Llaya cupped his face, tears hovering. Stop believing protection is money. You give me what he never could, truth. I don't need glass towers. I need this. She pressed his hand against her heart. I choose you, Caleb. Every day I choose you. Meanwhile, Alexander doubled down. As his legal barrage unfolded, he launched a public relations campaign portraying himself as victim. He appeared on carefully selected programs, his once commanding voice measured into sorrowful tones. Seated across from a prim anchor, he sighed dramatically. Can you imagine, he said, spending a lifetime building everything for someone, only to watch them throw it away for a man who gave nothing? He shook his head softly, salt gray hair gleaming under lights. I bought her the world. And she chose scraps. For some, the performance worked. Sympathy threads blossomed on investor forums. Shareholders called him a wronged man. But for millions of ordinary people, the act rang hollow. Online, one viral comment captured the sense perfectly. He bought her the world, but maybe no one buys love. The public began choosing sides. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Team Royce pitted against hashtag Love Can't Be Bought. Across dinner tables and workplace chatter, strangers debated whether Llaya was a foolish romantic or a brave rebel. Caleb's music, once heard only by a handful of locals, suddenly had millions of clicks as supporters sought the man who dared cut through billions with melody. The pinnacle came when one of his songs, written for Llaya, leaked online. Verses about finding warmth in a storm of gold, about a woman trading diamonds for breath. Commentators called it a dagger aimed at billionaires. Fans raised it as anthem. Concert venues invited him, reporters wanted profiles. Caleb found himself an unwilling symbol of defiance. Yet the notoriety only enraged Alexander further. In whispered talks with allies he fumed, "A clown with a guitar humiliates me and the world applauds. No, not while I live." He planted stories accusing Caleb of cheating during relationships prior, of exploiting Llaya's vulnerability, of reveling in fame masking as virtue. But these stories, unlike the polished spin meant for corporations, fell flat in a new world hungry for authenticity. Each lie sparked more sympathy. Each attack revealed Alexander's obsession. Still, obsession makes men dangerous. One evening, as snow fell heavy on the streets, Llaya received a knock at the apartment door. When she opened it, a courier stood nervously, shivering. In his hands, a velvet box, no note. Inside, a necklace glittered, an emerald so large it seemed unreal. Her breath locked. "It's from him," Caleb said darkly, his fists tightening. "He's still trying to buy you back." She snapped the box shut, tears filling her eyes. "He doesn't understand. He never will." Without hesitation she hurled it into the trash. The crash of emerald against steel rang like a declaration. Caleb kissed her forehead. "Then it's war, Llaya. And we'll fight not with his weapons, but with ours." That weekend they appeared together for the first time in public, hand in hand at one of Caleb's small gigs. Cameras flashed viciously, headlines shouted betrayal, but the crowd inside roared with applause, hundreds chanting her name and his. For once she wasn't ornament. She wasn't queen or socialite. She was just herself, standing beside music, not money. Back in his penthouse, Alexander watched the footage replay. His jaw tightened, glass shattering in his grip. Inside him coiled not sorrow but something darker, a vow. "If the world insists on worshipping her betrayal," he whispered, staring out over the skyline he once owned absolutely, "then I'll teach them all the cost of treason against a king." The love triangle had burned into something far more dangerous now. A billionaire stripped of love but armed with endless resources. A woman clinging to truth despite being publicly crucified. And a musician unwillingly crowned as symbol against power. The storm was no longer personal. It was public. It was legend in the making. And Alexander Royce, a man who once bought the world, prepared to remind everyone what it looked like when a king lashes out at both queen and knight. The new year arrived not with fireworks but subpoenas. Alexander Royce had escalated the war, dragging Llaya and Caleb deeper into the labyrinth of his unrelenting vengeance. Court dates multiplied, injunctions froze accounts, lawyers appeared like vultures dressed in silk ties. For Caleb, the sudden public attention was overwhelming. Yesterday's anonymous bar singer became, overnight, a man people recognized in grocery aisles, his name screamed by journalists outside brownstone doors. At first he recoiled. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. But the internet had crowned him anyway, the troubadour who toppled a titan. And then came the offers. A streaming service wanted his songs, a promoter pitched a tour. He should have been thrilled, years of struggle finally rewarded, but every victory felt tainted. Crowds didn't gather for his music alone. They gathered because a billionaire hated him. "This isn't fame," he muttered one night, strumming in frustration as Llaya sat beside him. "It's spectacle. They clap not for me, but for sticking it to Alexander Royce." She touched his hand gently. "And maybe that's fine. Symbols matter. But you need to remember, you're not a symbol to me. You're just Caleb." He kissed her then, grounding himself in the truth of her. But when the applause of strangers rose again outside their windows, he realized spectacle rarely allows men to remain just themselves. Llaya herself was carrying heavier burdens. The lawsuits had tarnished her into caricature. Every grocery aisle checkout mocked her in glossy ink. The queen who fled the crown. The heiress who prefers guitars to gold. Interviewers begged for her comment, vultures framing her either as tragic heroine or reckless fool. Some praised her bravery. Others spat her name with disdain. Her family, once so proud of her royal attachment, now refused to answer calls. Invitations from society vanished, her credit line spider severed by Alexander's allies. She lived now not in penthouses but in Caleb's modest walk-up, a radiator clanking louder than any orchestra had ever played. And yet in strange ways she felt freer. She cooked for herself. She walked streets without convoys trailing. She laughed at Caleb's stubborn optimism as he fixed a broken cabinet with duct tape instead of staff. These tiny fragments of ordinary life became jewels more precious than any ruby Alexander had pressed into her hands. Still, fear lingered. Because as much as Alexander's attempts to destroy them faltered in public sympathy, his power was not yet broken. She saw it one afternoon when a black sedan idled too long near the curb. Its tinted windows glared like watchful eyes. She saw it in leaked stories planting questions about Caleb's taxes, about his inflated talent, sour words meant to rot his credibility. Each attempt backfired eventually, but the constant siege gnawed at her nerves. "He'll never stop," she whispered one rainy night, collapsing into Caleb's lap. "He doesn't want me back anymore. He just wants us burned down until there's nothing left to stand on." Caleb stroked her hair softly. "Then we don't give him ashes. We give him something he can't touch." "And what's that?" she asked through tears. "Our refusal to break," he replied. "The more he pushes, the tighter we hold." Her sobs quieted, soothed not by money or status but by his unyielding faith. She realized then how strange it was. Alexander had purchased islands, palaces, monuments, yet here, on a cracked sofa in a tiny apartment, she felt safer than she ever had before. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander's fury grew more poisonous as each attempt to bury them backfired. Online, fan clubs for Caleb's music multiplied. Editorials mocked Alexander's obsession, some professors even citing the Llaya-Caleb conflict as proof of power's fragility when confronted with love. That word, love, infuriated him more than all the articles combined. One night in his penthouse, staring at glass towers he once bent effortlessly to his will, he whispered bitterly, "They'll call it love now. But wait. Let time rot them too. Let the simplicity she craves grind into poverty. Then she'll remember what she walked away from, and regret." And yet, deep in that vow, a different truth haunted him. He missed her. Not her role, not her glow at galas. The way she had laughed before doubt. The way her eyes softened before defiance. But admitting that meant admitting billions had failed to secure something simple, and Alexander Royce had built his life on never failing. Weeks passed. The war dragged on. But slowly, quietly, tides shifted. Judges dismissed many of his lawsuits as spurious. Journalists grew tired of recycled smears. Investors whispered that personal spectacle threatened Royce Global far more than two lovers living modestly ever could. And for the first time, Alexander felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in: loss. Irreversible, undeniable loss. Meanwhile, Llaya blossomed in anonymity's strange spotlight. She began writing again, short essays for digital journals about authenticity, about breaking out of gilded cages. Millions read them, not because she was Royce's ex but because her words resonated with ordinary people suffocated by their own smaller cages. The world began to see her less as scandal and more as symbol, a woman who chose love over empire. One evening, Caleb came home to find her at the kitchen table, ink smudged on her fingers, smiling softly for the first time in weeks. "What are you writing?" he asked. "A piece," she said, "about honesty as the only currency that never devalues." He kissed her ink-stained hand. "That's exactly why he never could keep you." She leaned against him. "No, Caleb. That's exactly why I found you." News of her essay spread. Online it was republished millions of times. Students quoted her in speeches. Caleb's concerts filled with people who saw them less as tabloid fodder and more as proof that hearts could dare stand against billion-dollar cages. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't stop Alexander from plotting. But in those quiet triumphs, Llaya realized something monumental. For the first time in her life, people weren't talking about Alexander Royce buying the world. They were talking about her. Her voice. Her choice. And for the first time since she'd stepped into his roaring orbit, she felt not ornament, not pawn, not queen, She felt like Llaya Carter again, her own. Alexander Royce had never learned the art of surrender. In his world, retreat was theft and compromise was humiliation. Empires weren't given up, they were reclaimed by force. So when lawsuits faltered and public sympathy shifted toward Llaya and Caleb, he refused to fold. He poured his venom into one final play, destruction not in court, not in headlines but in legacy. He would erase them from the story. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Royce's media companies began preparing a documentary meant to frame the entire ordeal, not as a tale of a woman's defiance, but as a tragedy of betrayal committed against him. Carefully edited footage spliced together snippets of Evelyn laughing at galas, Caleb exiting bars disheveled, anonymous witnesses describing her hunger for status. It was propaganda disguised as truth, and Alexander intended its release to be his crowning counterstrike. The previews leaked one February morning. Llaya sat at the breakfast table in Caleb's cramped apartment, scrolling on her phone as her heart dropped. The screen read, "Inside the betrayal, how one woman nearly brought down a king." Her face glared back at her in icy close-ups. Caleb's name was dragged beneath as the opportunist who played accomplice. The comments beneath were vicious. "She left wealth for a loser. Classic gold digger behavior. Pretend she didn't want money but look where she is now." The familiar wounds reopened, deeper than before. Tears blurred her vision. Caleb leaned over her shoulder, his jaw locked tight. "He's not finished," he said bitterly. "He'll scorch the entire earth just so no one remembers your truth." She shut her phone and buried her head in her hands. What if he wins, Caleb? What if history writes me as nothing more than his tragic little footnote? That night, they walked aimlessly through the city, winter winds biting their faces. Caleb stopped beneath a street lamp, taking her icy hands in his calloused palms. His dark eyes burned with rare fire. "Then you write history yourself," he said fiercely. "Stop letting him hold the pen. That's what scares him most. You've already stolen his crown once by choosing freedom. But now you need to use your voice before he takes it back with lies." Llaya stared at him, heart thundering. "You think anyone wants to hear me anymore?" Caleb smiled faintly. "They already listen, Llaya. Your essay, that little piece about honesty, it spread across the world. That wasn't him, wasn't me. That was you. Don't you see? He built you a cage. But you built a platform." The idea stirred something deep, dormant but undeniable. For months she had merely reacted, fought him blow for blow. But perhaps the greater victory wasn't in surviving his fury. Perhaps it was in seizing the narrative entirely. Within 2 weeks, an idea had grown into movement. A publisher approached her with interest in a memoir. "Tell your side," they urged. "Not gossip. Not spectacle. The truth." At first the thought terrified her. Laying herself raw against the world, every flaw, every confession? But Caleb encouraged her with unwavering conviction. "It's not just survival anymore. It's reclaiming yourself." Meanwhile, Alexander prepared his documentary premiere as if it were wartime theater. Invitations went to investors, politicians, influential journalists. "Re-establish the record," he told aides. "Let the world remember me as king, not cuckold." The night before its release, however, something unexpected happened. Llaya went public first. Seated in a modest studio, her voice steady, she released a video. Just her, no edits, no spin. Dressed plainly, hair pulled back, she spoke directly. "People have told my story for me. Tonight I tell it myself. Yes, I lived in a palace. Yes, I was showered in gifts grander than imagination. But wealth without freedom is a cage of diamonds. And one day I found a crack and stepped through. I didn't leave for ambition. I didn't leave for spectacle. I left for a cup of coffee shared in honesty. I left for laughter that wasn't staged. I left because love isn't bought. And if the world is angrier at that than at lies, so be it. I stand by truth." The message went viral within hours. Shared across continents, streamed millions of times. Hashtags surged, hashtag love can't be bought trending higher than Alexander's carefully choreographed media launch. Suddenly his documentary looked like spite compared to her authenticity. The next day Alexander's premiere unraveled before his eyes. Stories shifted from his regal narrative to Llaya's raw confession. Investors whispered concerns. He looks like a bitter relic clinging to control. In boardrooms, directors fidgeted nervously. For the first time, Alexander faltered in private. Alone in his penthouse, he watched her video 3, 4, 5 times. His scotch sat untouched. His empire surrounded him, glowing. And yet, he whispered reluctantly into the silence, "She beat me. Not with money. With words." Back in their apartment, Caleb embraced Llaya as she wept. Not from fear this time but catharsis. "You turned the page yourself," he whispered. "Now nothing he prints can trap you again." Yet even in victory, scars lingered. She knew Alexander Royce would not vanish quietly. But she also knew something much greater. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of him. The triangle, once private affair, had become parable. Talk shows debated it as metaphor for society. Professors dissected it in lectures on power and freedom. Surveys showed the public was no longer divided. The verdict was clear. Authenticity had triumphed over billions. But none of that mattered to Llaya when Caleb sang to her late at night. His voice cracked but honest, his songs no longer hidden in smoke-stained bars but echoing against the walls of larger venues packed with faces who believed in him. She watched him sing and thought, here it is. The one thing he never could buy. And Alexander Royce, man who bought palaces and seas, sat alone with his billions rattling like chains, realizing the same truth too late. Spring thawed the city's icy streets, but in Alexander Royce's penthouse the air remained winter. Curtains stayed drawn, meetings cancelled, aides dismissed. The titan who once bent laws and lives with checks now sat alone in his fortress of glass, stock tickers flashing silently on screens no one updated anymore. When news outlets ran segments about Llaya Carter's memoir in progress, Uncaged, My Story, the billionaire didn't rage as he might have once. Instead, he muted the television and stared at his reflection in the black screen. A man perfectly tailored, profoundly alone. For the first time, Alexander faced a truth he could not outspend. She was gone not because he couldn't buy her enough, but because he had never understood her heart in the first place. Meanwhile, across town, Caleb Hart stood backstage at a small but sold-out theater. His hands trembled, not from fear of strings snapping but from disbelief. Rows of seats filled with people had come not for a curious spectacle, but because they had listened, sung along in kitchens, wept privately at lyrics about freedom. Llaya sat in the front row, her smile radiant but grounded, no longer the rehearsed grin of society's ornament. As she watched him step into the spotlight, she realized the enormity of their defiance. They had survived the relentless storm of a man who once owned oceans. Survived because they chose each other, not monuments. When Caleb began singing, the song he'd written for her on that rain-soaked night in the park, audiences swayed and phones lit the air. For the first time, his voice resounded not just as rebellion but as a rival. And Llaya, tears shimmering down her cheeks, knew. He was giving her everything Alexander never could. Presence. Honesty. Peace. But Alexander Royce did not exit history quietly. When his documentary collapsed under Llaya's viral confession, when lawsuits drained more money than they wounded, when investors whispered of cutting him loose, he tried one final move, offering her everything. One morning, a package arrived at her apartment. A single letter in his handwriting, sharp and furious yet trembling under control. Come back. Not for jewelry, not for wealth. I'll give you freedom itself. Name anything. The world is still mine to give. You once said love is what I failed at. Let me prove even love can be mastered. Llaya read it twice, her heart heavy not with temptation but with grief. She wrote nothing in reply. Her silence was the true end. Reporters speculated endlessly. Would she forgive him? Would Caleb last? Was her choice still romantic, or had she ruined herself long-term? But among ordinary people, the conclusion was already written. Alexander Royce was a king who mistook gold for love, and Llaya Carter walked away to reclaim her humanity. Months later, Alexander quietly resigned from Royce Global Holdings. Rumors of exile carried. Some said he'd moved to Switzerland, others whispered about yachts anchored permanently offshore. His empire carried on, but his presence in it had vanished. A footnote in the very history he had sought to dominate. Llaya's memoir, released that autumn, became an international bestseller. Critics praised her not as saint nor sinner, but as a voice daring to say what millions secretly feared, that cages of privilege are still cages. Talk shows dissected her words, and young people held her book like manifesto. Caleb toured not as tabloid character but as musician. His songs, once about longing, now surged with hope. Each night he sang the line that had become their anthem, "Love can't be purchased, it can only be given." Crowds screamed it back, a chorus louder than any boardroom decree. Through it all, what mattered most was never the stages or sales, nor the viral essays. What mattered was the quiet. The small apartment they kept long after money trickled back into their lives. The nights they cooked pasta again, laughing when sauce burned. The mornings when Llaya watched sunlight bathe his tired face after touring, the mundane made magnificent because it was real. She sometimes touched the tiny scar on her wrist where Alexander's diamond bracelet once pressed too tightly. Not as trauma but as memory, proof that she had once been locked in a gilded life and walked away whole. And Alexander? The world no longer cared where he napped or whom he called. He had bought seas, towers, jewels and names, but in the end he lost to something his empire couldn't catalog. A love too simple, too true, too human. On a warm summer night, Caleb ended a set in Madrid with silence hanging thick. Then he called softly from stage, "This song is for the reason I can stand here at all." Llaya, in the shadows of the wings, lifted her eyes, stunned as the crowd erupted in applause. He began to play their song, the one born in that park with winds biting cold. But this time it carried not defiance but gratitude. Tears slid down her smile as she realized the irony. Alexander Royce once promised to buy her the world. He gave her villas, islands, jewelry, empires. But the world was never hers until she sat here, sweaty stage lights, ordinary guitar, a man she loved singing not to audiences but to her. Caleb's voice wavered as he met her eyes mid-lyric. "The world can be bought but love lives free." The crowd roared. Llaya pressed her palms to her lips, heart swelling against ribs. Money had tried to cage her, had nearly drowned her, had almost rewritten her legacy as betrayal. Yet here she was, living the one thing money could never offer. Freedom. Love. Truth. That became the legacy no lawsuit, no billionaire fury, no lost crown could touch. And in time, history remembered them not as scandal but as lesson. The richest man alive had tried to buy everything. But the waitress turned heiress who refused him proved what empires forget. Life's greatest currency is love unpurchased.